I'm going to begin today by talking a little bit about cultural references, what they are, specific to Japan, and discuss how we as science communicators can incorporate these into our texts. And I'm going to ask you to contribute some ideas as well. I'd like to begin by tipping my hat to Elizabeth Tasker from JAXA for the inspiration for this workshop and for some of the examples I'll use today. Cultural elements are items that make one society different from another. So cultural references can include specific places, aspects related to history, songs, literature, institutions, popular characters, mythologies, food and drink, currencies, and systems of weight and measurement. There are two cultural references on this page. I wonder if you know them. On the left-hand side is a little character called Higgs-tan. Higgs-tan is the icon symbol of a website that produces, or where you can find 4 comics on elementary particle physics. And the photograph is of a statue that can be found on the University of Tokyo Hongo campus grounds. Everybody knows the famous statue of Hachiko, which is outside Shibuya Station, but this one is of Hachiko with the guardian, Dr. Ueno Hidesaburo, who was an agricultural scientist. So after I've looked at some cultural references, we'll then review the pre-homework, and a few people did supply some interesting answers to the homework, and then we'll do some workshop tasks and finally wrap up. So, cultural references. Here's a photograph. Can anybody tell me what cultural reference this is? What is this photograph? What does it represent? You can write it in the chat if you don't wish to put your hands up. Can anybody tell me what that reference is there in the chat? People running a marathon, possibly, yes. Hiraga-san, Ekiden, yes. And Claire Debenham, Ekiden, yes, exactly. Claire, what is an Ekiden?
It's a sort of marathon relay race run particularly at the New Year between Tokyo and Hakone by university teams. Each runner runs a relatively short distance for a marathon and hands the baton on, but they run all the way to Hakone and all the way back again over 2 days at New Year. So it's very evocative of watching the television after you've eaten too much osechi ryori.
Yes, that's a perfect explanation. It's a teams-based relay race, and the most famous one is the Hakone Ekiden, as Claire suggested. It's over 207 kilometers over 2 days, and it's a teams-based race. Each runner wears a sash, and they must hand that sash to the next runner in the team. If one runner fails to hand the sash over properly or fails to meet the time requirement, then the whole team fails. The teamwork aspect of the Ekiden makes it so much different to a marathon or ultra marathon. What has this got to do with science communication? Well, in his biography, Professor Yamanaka Shinya likened scientific research to an Ekiden rather than a marathon. And in that, he was stressing the fact that scientific research is a teams-based activity. If one fails, the whole scientific endeavor may fail as well. And so this is a reference that is very Japanese, if you like, and very culture specific. And if we were writing about it in a scientific communication, just saying relay race wouldn't be sufficient. It is so much more than a relay race. In fact, it's so popular in Japan, this race, the New Year's race, that nearly half the population watch it on TV. The next culture-specific reference is a shakuhachi, a Japanese bamboo flute, and it is not only a representation of music, but also has references to traditional materials such as bamboo and the measurement system. The shakuhachi has a specific length, 1 shaku and 8 sun, representing about 54 centimeters. The coins of Japan are a cultural reference, of course, and each coin tells a story. The 5 yen coin, I hope you can see it, it's a little bit dark. Can anybody tell me the story of the 5 yen coin? Why is it different to the others? And what do the designs represent? Yes, Iwata-san, you do mention that there wasn't the Hakone Ekiden because the bibs have prefectural names. That, in fact, was a corporate Ekiden. Yes, Jens Wilkinson, it's holy. Yes, it is holy. It has a hole in the middle of the coin. The design on the coin, in fact, the 5 yen coin is the oldest of the current Japanese coins, made in 1949, just after the Second World War, and contains symbols around the circle. We can see rice, water, and a gear representing agriculture, fisheries, and industry, and the hope that Japan would recover soon from its wartime devastation. So there's a story there as well. The tatami mat, of course, tells its own story. It is not only a traditional flooring material, but is also a unit of measurement. And we talk about rooms being certain sizes of tatami. And, sorry, the final picture in this series, can anyone tell me where that is? What is that? Can anyone guess? Yes, Hiraga-san, it's Tokyo Dome. It's Tokyo Dome. Now, Tokyo Dome is a cultural reference as well that's very, very common in Japanese writing. Why is it common? Because it's used as a form of area comparison. People talk about something being equivalent in area to so many Tokyo domes. Now, for example, a landslide might be 30 hectares in extent, equivalent to 6 Tokyo domes. Now, this is a cultural reference that really does need to be localized before we write about it to a non-Japanese audience. Tokyo Dome may not mean much to lots of Japanese people. It certainly doesn't mean much at all to people in other cultures. What might you use if you are writing for a different audience as an area comparison? What might you use? Can you write in the chat? Instead of using the Tokyo Dome, is there anything else that you could use? Yes, a soccer stadium, a football field, Madison Square Garden, that's a good one. In Australia, the MCG, the Melbourne Cricket Ground, that would be excellent. Wembley Stadium, yes. Yeah, they're all good suggestions. And if you're looking for a generic equivalent though, you might say, for example, the Tokyo Dome area is equivalent to 6 soccer pitches or 30 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So many cultural references, I would suggest, would be best left in the original so that we can explain the reference and add color to it. But this one, Tokyo Dome, is probably one that is best localized. So, in the first SciComm Japan SciComm Forum in 2018, Mary Wojtek from NASA spoke about using cultural references to engage with audiences, mentioning Doraemon as an example of a time traveler when you're communicating with a Japanese audience, and Doctor Who as a similar reference point for US or British audiences. While this is an important point about localizing your communications for a given audience, I think it's also important to try to incorporate Japanese cultural references into our communications wherever possible. Two other quotes from the same article reviewing Japan SciComm Forum 2018 are also relevant. A brief observation that Japanese language press releases are generally detailed, longer in length, and technical compared with English language press releases. There's another point about press releases of other science communications from Japan that is also important. They often include cultural references without any explanation, simply because they know their audience, and the audience is already familiar with the allusions there. And the authors also go on to say, the 2020 Olympics may also be an occasion for Japan to leverage its world-famous pop culture, like mascots, animation, in the service of science. Echoing this sentiment, Matt Wood from the University of Tsukuba suggests that anthropomorphism, assigning human characteristics to non-human subjects, which is very common in Japan, can offer a similar framework for dealing with new or challenging topics, as well as affective and attitudinal influences that may be important for motivating comprehension and encouraging attitude and behavior change. He mentions the manga and anime series Cells at Work, or Hataraku Saibo in Japanese. In this series, components of the body, such as red blood cells, platelets, and other entities such as bacteria and viruses are portrayed with human characteristics that do battle with each other in entertaining and educational episodes. The series is not only popular in Japan, but also overseas, and even more so on YouTube, where Western doctors watch and react to and explain the medical science behind these anime episodes. They are so popular, you can find that many of them have up to 10 million views. So certainly there's much to be potentially gained from leveraging these anthropomorphic characters in the service of science communication. I want to now switch to an example I mentioned before, where the Japanese text assumes that the reader is familiar with a cultural reference. This is an extract from a web article on the Hayabusa II mission to the asteroid Ryugu. Without any further clarification, the text says, as it might help explain the origin of our oceans, the asteroid visited by Hayabusa II was named Ryugu. Well, that might mean something to a Japanese audience, but to a non-Japanese audience, it's completely mystifying. The allusion to a Japanese folktale is really lost on a non-Japanese audience. At a minimum, I would suggest that the text should include something like this. Change the period to a comma and write, after the mythical Ryugu palace, which lay at the bottom of the sea in Japanese folklore. The cultural reference here is the story of Urashima Taro, a fisherman who rescues a turtle from being tortured, teased by a group of school children. The grateful turtle invites Urashima to the Dragon Palace, Ryugu Palace, at the bottom of the ocean, where the turtle turns into a princess. The princess and Urashima stays with the princess for a few days, but he becomes homesick. And the princess gives him a box to take home, but tells him, don't open it. When Urashima returns to his village, he finds that hundreds of years have passed and everybody he knows is dead. So in despair, he opens the box and all of a sudden becomes old. That's because the mysterious box contained his old age. And so this allusion, this folktale, is likened to the trip by Hayabusa II, the spacecraft, which visited Ryugu, the asteroid, and brought back a box of samples. So that's a really, really nice cultural reference that does demand some explanation, I think. Sometimes we need to be careful and remind ourselves that cultures, things that we think might be shared cultural references may not in fact be shared. Here's another example of a line from a scientific biography. If a gene was really important, the cell would not undergo reprogramming in its absence. It was just like the story of Columbus's egg. Now, the story of Columbus's egg may be familiar to Japanese people, and it may well be familiar to Americans and perhaps Europeans, but it's not familiar in all audiences around the globe, and certainly not necessarily in all English-speaking audiences. I had never heard of it before. Columbus's egg is, the story of Columbus's egg is that Columbus was sitting at dinner with some fellow diners when he challenged them to make an egg stand on its tip. The others tried and failed, and then Columbus took the egg, tapped it on the table to flatten its base, and then sat it up on the table. And the moral of the story is that something may look difficult at first, but it's obvious after you've been shown the solution. So in this particular case, it's a cultural reference that we might imagine is shared by both the writer and the reader, but in this particular case, we need to make sure that an explanation is given as well. In this case, I might change the period to a colon and continue on with the explanation after that. There are plenty of places where we can find cultural references and science communications as models for our own writing. And I've taken some models here from the Best American Science and Nature Writing in 2020. And this is, I think this is a very good opening. In January, the China National Space Administration landed a spacecraft on the far side of the moon, the side we can't see from Earth. Chang'e 4 was named for a goddess in Chinese mythology who lives on the moon for reasons connected to her husband's problematic immortality drink. It's a very intriguing opening line, and it really does make you want to read on. The writer later continues, you may have watched the near operatic progress of Chang'e 4's graceful landing, or the uncannily cute robotic amblings of the lander's companion, the U-2 rover, named for the moon goddess's white rabbit. So this cultural reference is taken all the way through this particular chapter, and I quite enjoyed that one. There are some more examples here as well. A very simple way of representing a cultural reference. The crater and the asteroid were named Chicxulub after a small Mayan town near the epicenter. Very simple way, giving it a definition. Another one gives a definition in the same way and then adds an amusing or relevant point. He would later name this dwarf planet Eris after the Greek goddess of strife and discord. And oh, how much strife this thing caused. So I think that's another good example. And the third example from the same book is this, a slightly different way of adding the information here. In the experiment, a primitive by today's standards chatbot that Weizenbaum named Eliza, M- for the George Bernard Shaw ingenue, responded in writing to statements by the study subjects. Now, in this case, a pair of M-dashes are used to enclose the extra information. We might normally use a pair of commas for this process, but if you look at the sentence, there are already a couple of other commas here, and I think using 2 more commas would be a little over the top. So the M-dashes are quite suitable. The Hayabusa missions are full of cultural references. And I'd like to very quickly look at this. Hayabusa 1. The word Hayabusa in Japanese means peregrine falcon, a bird that's well known for traveling long distances and returning often or frequently to its nesting sites and breeding sites and wintering sites. The name Hayabusa in Japanese has been used for many different things. A World War II fighter plane, the Tohoku Shinkansen bullet train, and a range of motorcycles, among many others. The mission of Hayabusa 1 was to travel to the asteroid Itokawa. Now, asteroid Itokawa was named after Dr. Itokawa, the pioneer of Japan's rocket science industry. People called him Dr. Rocket. He was actually also the designer of that Hayabusa fighter plane in the Second World War, just coincidentally. Hayabusa 1 landed on the asteroid Itokawa and brought back samples from the surface. One other cultural reference that's embedded in the Hayabusa 1 mission that isn't Japanese, but is still interesting, are these rovers, the Minerva rover, micro-nano experimental robot vehicle for asteroid. That seems like a very tortured acronym, but it's very appropriate because Minerva is named after a Roman goddess, and the asteroid Itokawa is a member of the Apollo group of asteroids, named after the Roman god Apollo. So very appropriate in this case. We wouldn't necessarily include all of the cultural references in our communications. In some shorter communications, just one or two might be sufficient. But there are these and many more in the Hayabusa missions. One other interesting one in the Hayabusa II mission, which was the mission to the asteroid Ryugu, is this one. The Hayabusa II control room has a plush toy mascot here in the window. You can see it in the window there. The plush toy mascot is of an oarfish, which is a very strange mascot for an interplanetary mission. But in fact, the oarfish in Japanese is called Ryugu no Tsukai, which is a yokai, a supernatural entity, but in English it means messenger from Ryugu. So it's quite appropriate as a cultural reference to be explained in any communications. The Hayabusa II mission actually had two rovers that were skipping across the surface of the asteroid. This time they were both called Minervas, but they had alternative nicknames, and one was called Ibor and the other one was called Auru, after the French and English names for the owl. Why would they be called an owl? Well, if you have a look at depictions of Minerva, the Roman goddess, she's often seen with an owl, which reflects her relationship with wisdom and knowledge. So there are all these wonderful cultural references that are embedded in the mission, and there are some playful ones as well. This is the last one I'd like to speak about with the Hayabusa mission. The retrieval team of scientists who went from Japan to Australia to pick up the capsule containing the samples from Ryugu, asteroid Ryugu, was known as JL8823. Why JL8823? Well, that's because the numbers 8823 in Japanese can be pronounced Hayabusa. And so it's a very appropriate flight number for the retrieval team to fly in. And there was one final point about the mission and the retrieval. The crew went down to Australia and returned on flight JL8823, but the sample, the box of the sample, was returned on a private charter plane, and the charter plane was a Dassault Falcon. So it completes the circle for the Hayabusa mission. The mission was named after a Falcon, and the aeroplane that brought the samples back to Japan was also a Falcon. Here's another reason why including cultural references in science communications from Japan. In Professor Yamanaka's biography, he says he was disappointed with that the name he'd chosen for a gene that he had discovered wasn't accepted by the international scientific community. He says, it's a source of some frustration that the names given by non-Japanese researchers to a new discovery may become more accepted than those given by the original Japanese discoverer. But he does acknowledge that the name he gave to the gene was not as interesting as the name given by the co-discoverers in the West. He says, at the same time, I thought that uninspiring names like Nat1 and ECAT4 would never stick. I must admit that the name Nanog, from the Celtic phrase Tir Nanog, which means land of eternal youth, is much more romantic. Okay, in this case, but perhaps a vigorous science communications campaign associated with the publication of his research could have helped to promote the Japanese nomenclature. In the next case, the Japanese name has been accepted by the scientific community, and it's a really interesting name and very appropriate for this week with Halloween just around the corner. A group of researchers at the University of Tsukuba, and thanks to Matt Wood from the university for this tip, discovered a fruit fly gene in a group of developmental genes called the Halloween gene family. And the Halloween gene family includes genes that are known as spook, spookier, phantom, disembodied, shadow, and shade. So they're all appropriately named genes for the Halloween family. And the Japanese group, when they discovered this particular gene, they named it Nokberabo. And of course, those of us who know anything about Japanese yokai would recognize that Nokberabo are supernatural entities in Japanese folklore. They look like ordinary human beings and blend in perfectly with human society, but they have no face, no eyes, no mouth, no nose or features of any kind. You often encounter them on quiet, empty roads at night when nobody else is around. And like many other yokai of this kind, their main activity seems to be scaring people. So Nokberabo fits in perfectly with the category of Halloween genes. But again, if you were writing or translating anything related to this topic, it would require some explanation. We shouldn't forget that there's a long tradition of Japanese names of diseases being accepted into the international community. Moyamoya disease, a disease in which the internal carotid arteries, which feed the brain, are blocked, new blood vessels are created, and on CT scans, these new blood vessels look like puffs of smoke, hence the name Moyamoya disease. Some diseases are named after their discoverers, in this particular case, Takayasu arteritis and Kawasaki disease, and so on. Kabuki syndrome, named because sufferers of the disease have faces that resemble kabuki makeup. And of course, Minamata disease, which is named after a particular site in Japan.